Tēnā tātou katoa. Nau mai, haere mai, piki mai. Ki tēnei ākoranga mō Manaakitanga I te paipira tāpu. Ina rā, ko te pukapuka o Koreneti tuatahi. Tēnā koutou, tēnā koutou, tēnā koutou katoa. Hello to you all, and welcome to this webinar about hospitality in the Bible, specifically in the book of 1 Corinthians. Thank you very much for joining us. Ko taupiri te maunga, ko wakato te awa, ko Lord William Bentinck te waka, ko te huiamarangi o te manoa te whiki, rāua ko te piopatanga o wakato me taranaki o ko piopatanga, ko hemi tapu marae, rāua ko te wharikarikia mātua o pita tapu, o ko tūranga waiwai, ko Pākehā rāua ko hiaina o ko iwi, ko Benjamin Ong, tōku ingoa. Taupiri is the mountain, Waikato is the river, the Lord William Bentinck is the waka, the huiamarangi o te manawa te whiki, and the diocese of Waikato and Taranaki are my diocese. Hemi Tapu Marae and the Cathedral of St. Peter's are my standing grounds. Pākehā in Chinese are my tribes or my people. And my name is Benjamin Ong. Kia ora. Today we're going to talk about hospitality in the Bible, namely Paul's view of it in 1 Corinthians, particularly in terms of inclusion and exclusion at the table. Once we discuss this, we will then talk about the impact and application that Paul's teaching around hospitality may have for us today. In my opinion, typically when we think of hospitality in our minds, we default to serving people at the table or providing cups of tea when someone comes to visit our homes. This is indeed a part of hospitality, but I think hospitality extends far beyond this. When we in the West consider the word hospitality, typically we think of entertaining people, particularly people who are like us, in the same social network or economic class. In church, we might consider hospitality to be the greeters at the door or providing a cup of tea at the end of the service, and maybe some conversation to follow that as well. Beyond our depictions of hospitality in the church, we encounter many different types of hospitality throughout various areas of our lives. Professor Christine Pohl, a prominent Christian social ethicist, criticizes what could be the Western demeaning of hospitality as transaction and industry. She writes, "Today, when we think of hospitality, we don't think of welcoming strangers. At least that's not the first thought. We picture having family and friends over for a pleasant meal. We think of the hospitality industry, of hotels and restaurants, which are open to strangers as long as they have money or credit cards. Perhaps large churches come to mind, with their hospitality committees that coordinate the coffee hour, greet visitors, or perhaps help with parking. In any case, today most understandings of hospitality have a minimal moral component. Hospitality is a nice extra if we have time or the resources, but we rarely view it as a spiritual obligation or as a dynamic expression of vibrant Christianity. This picture of hospitality in the Western world, however, is distant from the practice of hospitality in the ancient world. Ideally speaking, hospitality in the ancient cultures could be described as consisting of the welcome and care of guests, especially those who are travelers or strangers to family or community, or even the practice of receiving a guest or stranger graciously. But what does it mean for people to welcome, care, or receive a guest or stranger? Christine Pohl expands on this ambiguity in the language by defining hospitality as welcoming strangers into a home and offering them food, shelter, and protection. Another scholar, David Hattar, rightly points us back to one of the Greek words for hospitality, the word philoxenia, which can be split into two root words, phileo and xenos. Phileo meaning love or affection, and xenos meaning unfamiliar or strange. Therefore, Hatau rightly argues that the nuances of philoxenia can refer to the concept of benevolence done to those outside one's normal circle of friends. Hospitality in Hebrew and Greco-Roman cultures can revolve around the practice of caring and looking after strangers who cross our paths. There are two significant stories of people providing hospitality in Genesis, which we will read and briefly analyze to see these principles. The first of these is Abraham's encounter with angelic guests in Genesis 18, and the second is Lot's angelic visitation in Sodom at its destruction, which is in the following chapter. From Genesis 18 we read, "The Lord appeared to Abraham by the oaks of Mamre. As he sat at the entrance of his tent in the heat of the day, he looked up and saw 3 men standing near him. When he saw them, he ran from the tent entrance to meet them and bowed down to the ground. He said, 'My Lord, if I find favor with you, do not pass by your servant. Let a little water be brought, and wash your feet and rest yourselves under the tree. Let me bring a little bread, that you may refresh yourselves, and after that you may pass on, since you have come to your servant.' So they said, 'Do as you have said.' And Abraham hastened to the tent to Sarah, and said, 'Make ready quickly 3 measures of choice flour, knead it, and make cakes.' Abraham ran to the herd and took a calf, tender and good, and gave it to his servant, who hastened to prepare it. Then he took curds and milk, and the calf that he had prepared, and set it before him, and he stood by them under the tree while they ate." So what we read is of Abraham's response to 3 strangers crossing his path, as he sat at the entrance in the heat of the day. Abraham's immediate response to these people is to not only run to greet them using the proper greeting, in this case bowing to the ground, which likely means lying prostrate before them out of honor. And Abraham then continues to wash their feet and bring them food and other refreshments. Abraham then rushes away, delegating the preparation of this to Sarah and his servants. Once all is prepared, he brings it to his guests for their refreshment and remains nearby, under the tree where the guests ate, but Abraham does not join his guests. Abraham's hospitality here appears to be effortless and planned, as he urges the 3 men to stay with him, despite his frantic rushing about behind the scenes as the food is prepared. The second story of Lot and the angelic visitation occurs in Genesis 19. Again we read, "The 2 angels came to Sodom in the evening, and Lot was sitting in the gateway of Sodom. When Lot saw them, he rose to meet them and bowed down with his face to the ground. He said, 'Please, my lords, turn aside to your servant's house and spend the night, and wash your feet, then you can rise up early and go on your way.' They said, 'No, we will spend the night in the square.' But he urged them strongly, so they turned aside to him and entered the house. And he made them a feast and baked unleavened bread, and they ate. But before they lay down, the men of the city, the men of Sodom, both young and old, all the people, to the last man, surrounded the house, and they called to Lot, 'Where are the men who came to you tonight? Bring them out to us so that we may know them.' Lot went out of the door to the men, shut the door after him, and said, 'I beg you, my brothers, do not act so wickedly. Look, I have 2 daughters who have not known a man. Let me bring them out to you, and do to them as you please. Only do nothing to these men, for they have come under the shelter of my roof.' The first half of Lot's interaction with these angelic visitors is very similar to Abraham's encounter. Lot again is sitting outside when he saw the angels approaching Sodom. He offers to wash their feet and eventually make them a feast. However, this time the hospitality emphasizes the care and protection of his guests. Lot provides accommodation for the visitors and then protects the visitors from the gang of men who have come to rape them. Lot's decision to sacrifice his two unmarried daughters demonstrates the kind of duty he believes he has towards the guests and how highly he regards them. Nevertheless, judging Lot from today's understanding allows us to see that Lot chooses also to destroy the innocent lives of his daughters. Therefore, in this case, hospitality has a terrible cost, which is up to us to decide whether it is right or wrong, or perhaps the best that Lot could have done, or again, perhaps if it's an utter failure of Lot and his family's family responsibilities. Both of these examples of hospitality demonstrate the various aspects which Christine Pohl and David Hattar name in their definitions. The hospitality in the Old Testament indeed revolves around the care and protection and welcoming of strangers and travellers. Even if the host or those in the host family are unjustly forced to pay a terrible price for their hospitality. Nevertheless, as much as Hebrew hospitality involves care, protection, and welcoming of anyone that might pass by, this hospitality had its own limitations. Within the Israelite world and Second Temple Judaism, provision of hospitality was denied to people who were Gentiles or who might endanger their Israelite hosts' ritual purity. Even though hospitality was meant to be shown to all travellers and strangers, this primarily became an internal practice for the Israelites. That is, it is for those who exist inside a social or national identity boundary. Those outside are not welcomed, cared for, or protected. This is a part of the reason why the parable of the Good Samaritan is so shocking for Jesus' audience. For the person who was robbed was outside the social and religious circles of the Levite, priest, and scribe, who could have perceived him as a sinner, and therefore do not stop. But it is the Samaritan who is outside of all of these things, as well as outside of the national identity as a Jew, who comes and offers hospitality to the person who was robbed. Similarly, various limitations existed in the Greco-Roman world around citizenship, religious belief, and status and gender discrimination. Hospitality, particularly the hospitality shown in the sharing of a meal, was given with reciprocal obligation, which tended to revolve around the social currency of status. One gave hospitality so that many may know of their honour and prestige in the community. But we will talk further about the Greco-Roman hospitality as we analyse our passages. It is common to hear the Maori word Manaakitanga translated into English as hospitality. In one sense, Manaakitanga refers to what we have been talking about when we think of hospitality. Pa Henry Tate says, Manaaki is the exercise of mana, or spiritual prestige or power, in various forms of hospitality. The exercise of manaaki is a practical way of addressing and enhancing the tapu intrinsic being of manuhiri guests. It increases the mana of the hunga kainga, the home group, in terms of status and prestige in the eyes of the manuhiri. But as is usually the case with translations, there are other connotations in the word which remain hidden if hospitality is our only translation. One Tūhoi Kaumatua, Wayne Takawa, describes Manaakitanga this way. Manaakitanga has been loosely translated as hospitality, which is correct to a point, but it is a compound word, mana and aki. Mana, spiritual being or spiritual authority, Well, actually, mana, we say, has its source in God. So mana is given freely to us from God, and we can either increase it by our good deeds and achievements, or we can lessen it by being self-centered. Aki means towards someone or something. So pastoral care, as manaaki, means to offer hospitality to someone, my hospitality to someone. But as the mana has its source in God, you're offering God's hospitality to someone. Mana or spiritual power, therefore, is something that we use in relation to other beings. Mato Wayne and Pahenere agree that mana is revealed as ultimately sourced in God, and that mana can increase through its correct application in relation to others. In our case, the correct application of manaaki, expressing mana towards someone, increases the substance of who we are and increases the substance of who they are as another being. However, as Takawa says, mana can be diminished if we shun our relational obligations to others and only think of ourselves. That is, the refusal of hospitality towards another diminishes the very being of the other, and if done for the wrong reasons, can greatly diminish the mana of the refusing host. The provision or prohibition of hospitality by a host can not only affect the way people are perceived in the social sphere, but change the essence of their very real being. John Patterson turns to Whakatauki, Proverbs, to shed light on how Manaakitanga should be practiced. He says, if visitors arrive when you are eating, you should invite them to join you, otherwise they might complain. Kai ana mai koe he atua, noho ana ahau he tangata. You are eating there like a god. I am sitting here as a man. To fail to share with them may be seen as a grave insult, showing them that you regard them as being of inferior birth. Visitors too have their responsibilities. It can be seen as unacceptable, for example, to arrive after dark. Ko te uri anake te mea haere i te pō. Only the penis travels under the cover of darkness. It is expected that guests provide special delicacies also if they are in a position to do so. It is also likely to be seen as unacceptable to refuse hospitality if it is offered. E noho koe ko te rangi karehua, hei tauna kai atu manu. Sit still. It is te rangi karehua who is preparing a meal for you. If a chief thus pronounces rangi karehua's name, one is obliged to stay for the meal. These Whakatauki, Proverbs, and Patterson's explanation of them provide a clear picture of the responsibility and obligation of people to offer hospitality to those who have come their way. And for those travelling to remember to be timely in their arrival and bring a koha, donation or gift to the meal if they are able. The hopeful outcome of such encounters is for a mana win-win situation. That is, through the display of Manaakitanga, the host mana ought to increase in the eyes of the manuhiri, and through the reception of the Manaakitanga and an adherence to the tikanga or customs, the manuhiri ought to feel the increase of their own mana. Therefore, both parties should be increased by the encounter, and the relationship between te hunga kainga, the home people, and te manuhiri, the guests, should be strengthened. This has not been a detailed overview of Manaakitanga necessarily. For many of the concepts that we explored in relation to Hebrew and Greco-Roman hospitality carry over into the way some Māori describe Manaakitanga. What is perhaps more unique about this ideology is the connectedness Manaakitanga has with the person's connection with atua and with the link between Manaakitanga and the spiritual and overall well-being of the person. as well as some of the many tikanga around the practice of Manaakitanga itself, which in turn aid us in acting correctly so that the connection with the atua, or a person's well-being, are maintained or increased through our action. As we come to Paul in 1 Corinthians, we can interpret many of these aspects of hospitality in the text, particularly as we approach the table. 1 Corinthians contains 4 of the 5 texts where Paul interacts with food or the table in any detail. These are 1 Corinthians 5:9-13, 8:1-13, 10:14 through to 11:1, and 11:17-34. This presentation will examine 1 Corinthians chapter 5 verses 9-13, and then 1 Corinthians chapter 11 verses 17-34 to understand Paul's view around inclusion and exclusion of hospitality around the table. This is mainly because these verses hold the most important information for our discussion, but I encourage you to read the other 2 passages at a later date because they hold more information from which we can discern our theory and practice of hospitality around food and the table. We read in 1 Corinthians 5:9-13 of Paul instructing for the exclusion of a member of the community. The instruction here is primarily a non-association order from Paul. He commands the Corinthian church to refrain from associating with a certain type of person. Strangely, however, Paul extends his command in the final clause of verse 11. He includes the instruction, "Do not even eat with such a one." That is, the person cannot be given the hospitality of the table by anyone in the community, and that includes the Lord's Supper. Later in 1 Corinthians 11:17-22 and 33-34, Paul rebukes the Corinthian church's practice of the Lord's Supper. He describes their practice as almost nullifying the effects of the Lord's Supper, whatever they may be, and characterizes the meal of the main offenders as private or individual meals. Furthermore, in verse 21, Paul says that the practice results in one going hungry and another becoming drunk. Altogether, this results in the Corinthians' practice showing contempt for the church of God and humiliating those who have nothing. And at the very end of the chapter, Paul turns to his final instruction for the Corinthians' practice of the Lord's Supper. He tells the community that when they are all together, they must allelus ekdikiste, which means wait for or receive one another. This is how they will restore their community, for the time being at least. So let us first examine the situation in chapter 5, after which we shall look at chapter 11. Both of these analyses together will give us an idea of Paul's commands for including and excluding people from the table in 1 Corinthians. I'll quickly give you a brief history of Paul, the Corinthians, and what is known as the first letter to the Corinthians. The book of 1 Corinthians is first and foremost a letter to a relatively young church. The letter itself addresses various issues around divisions in the community. Paul's aim for the majority of the letter is to convince the Corinthians away from their division and bring them into reconciliation and unity. Paul, around 51 CE, went to Corinth to plant a church there. In Corinth, Paul converted a few Jews to the Christ group. After struggling, however, in the Corinthian synagogue for some time, Paul gives up on the Jewish Corinthians and turns his mission towards the Greco-Roman Corinthians. In total, Paul spent 18 months in Corinth planting the community, after which he continued his planting mission to other cities and regions. We have evidence from 1 Corinthians 1:11 and 5:9, as well as other passages, that there has been ongoing correspondence between Paul and the Corinthian Christ group, and that the letter we are looking at today is not the first of Paul's letters to the Corinthians, but at the very least second in a series of 4 or 5 letters, and perhaps more. This letter, written a few years after Paul's departure from Corinth, appears to address issues originating from the clash between Greco-Roman culture and the gospel, which results in widespread divisions. Okay, now let's begin looking at our passages. Chapter 5 sees Paul addressing issues of sexual immorality, specifically incest in the church. Therefore, he tells the Corinthians that they must clean out their group, which is the metaphorical dough. In light of these difficulties, Paul writes this passage. I'll read 1 Corinthians 5:9-13 and hold from the New Revised Standard Version, and then I'll talk more about what is going on between Paul and the church. Before we read this, you may want to have the passage there so that you can follow along, or just sit and listen. In either case, keep in mind the things that stand out for you in relation to hospitality. So we read, I wrote to you in my letter not to associate with sexually immoral persons, not at all meaning the immoral of this world, or the greedy and robbers, or idolaters, since you would then need to go out of the world. But now I am writing to you not to associate with anyone who bears the name of brother or sister who is sexually immoral, or greedy, or is an idolater, reviler, drunkard, or robber. Do not even eat with such a one. For what have I to do with judging those outside? Is it not those who are inside that you are to judge? God will judge those outside. Drive out the wicked person from among you. So Paul, in the context of talking about incest in the church, now clarifies an instruction he previously gave to the church in an earlier letter. He says that he wrote to them in a letter which is now lost to us, not to be associated with people who practice Paul's list of immoral behaviors. From verses 9 and 10, it would appear that the Corinthians, upon originally reading this, seem to have either used hyperbole to say that if that's what Paul wants, then they must leave the world entirely, or they have sincerely concluded that Paul wants them to become an isolated monastic community. But in verse 11, Paul clearly articulates his intended instruction. He is not meaning merely a person who can be characterized as involved in immoral behavior. Instead, it is specifically a person who, in the New Revised Standard Version, bears the name of a brother or sister, and yet is characterized through the list of immoral behaviors. In today's language, we might say Paul is not telling the church to dissociate with immoral non-Christians. Instead, he is telling them to dissociate with immoral Christians, which for him is an oxymoron. Furthermore, by bearing the name of brother or sister, Paul more likely means a person who self-professes themselves as a brother or sister. That is, a person who openly says, I am a sister or brother, or perhaps I am a Christ follower. And regarding the immoral behavior, Paul is not talking about those who struggle with what he considers immoral behavior, but those who freely participate in immoral behavior, of which the community is well aware, and that person is without remorse or contrition and becomes characterized by such behavior. Therefore, in this passage, Paul is not condemning the Christian person who is in the depths of poverty, but needs to provide food for their family, and so on multiple occasions they have taken food from a shop without paying for it. Paul does not talk about the Christian person who, after a week of slaving away at a lifeless job to make some faceless corporation their obscene profit for the week, feels empty and drinks until they're drunk every other weekend so that they can make it through yet another week. Instead, Paul is rebuking the Christian priest who uses their position of religious authority to take advantage of the weak, and continues to do it again despite being found out. It is the person who abuses their partner at home and comes to worship as if that abuse does not exist in this reality. It is the confessing Christian with this dissonance in their life who Paul commands to be excluded from the community and furthermore the table. The reason for this is particularly related to some of the reasons that I gave you earlier concerning why Israelites would refuse hospitality to various groups of people. Brian Rosner believes Paul links this situation with some of the temple code in Deuteronomy 15 and other chapters. Therefore, he deduces three ideas which inform Paul's decision about these people. They are holiness, corporate responsibility, and covenant. Since this is only a short lecture, we will only look at the idea of holiness. Holiness relates strongly with the Israelites' reasoning. Paul believes that since the Corinthians are called to be a holy people under Christ, this type of willful behaviour among their members directly affects the holiness of their community. Just like the leaven in the bread in 1 Corinthians 5, 6-8, Paul sees the unrepentant, self-professed Christians in the Corinthian community as infecting the whole community and leading them into immorality. This idea is similar to the well-known saying that one bad apple ruins the bunch. However, the consequence of this becomes more dire when we consider what might have been Paul's understanding of the church's holiness in relation to God. That is, as is reported in the Old Testament, the persistent immoral behavior of the Israelites defiled the nation and the temple, and therefore God could no longer dwell with them because God is holy. According to the Greco-Roman traditions around private meals and eating, it was believed that during the meal, the god of the meal, perhaps the Roman god Bacchus or Greek god Dionysus or Zeus or maybe Christ or whomever, would descend to the meal event and host the meal in spirit. This god was usually offered a portion of food or given a libation, which was when the wine at the end of the meal was offered to the god and a small portion of it was intentionally spilt on the ground. After this ritual, the participants in the meal were able to drink the wine freely. The Corinthian Christ group likely held a similar understanding to the Israelites around purity and the Greco-Romans around meal spirituality. Hence, this immoral Christian removes the holiness from the Christ group, consequently meaning that God is unable to descend to host the community and dwell with the community because, again, God does not manifest in defiled space. Furthermore, it was believed this type of impurity could be transmitted through the sharing of food, and particularly the sharing of drink. Therefore, not only must the Corinthians withdraw their fellowship from the immoral Christian, but they cannot eat with them due to the risk of themselves becoming impure. Through the eyes of our brief overview of Manaakitanga, we are reminded this exclusion has very real effects. Not only is the person being socially shamed, but their mana is being diminished. The state of diminished mana and consequential diminished tapu, or intrinsic being of the person, is the state Pahenere calls whakanoa, or a defiled state. Being in the state of whakanoa decreases the person's ability and capacity to relate to beings around them, whether it is atua God, whenua land, ia tangata anoa themselves, or e tahi atu tangata, other people. However, it would seem that the state of diminished mana and tapu again, in this case being the intrinsic being of the person, it would seem that this state of diminished mana and tapu in 1 Corinthians are primarily caused by the consequence of the actions of the excluded person on their own person. That is, the excluded person has already diminished themselves through lack of mana and in part, the community is merely recognizing the true state of that person. The hope of Paul is that the diminished person will be forced to confront themselves through the community's exclusion and will repent and come back into the community. Where the community can kia whakatapuhia ia, that is, the community can restore the person's intrinsic tapu, intrinsic being, through blessing and sanctification, which is set in stone once again through the sharing of food, similar to the way many porphyry or welcomings must finish with the sharing of food. Without the sharing of food, our coming together established by porphyry or welcoming is incomplete, and the host and guests remain tapu or foreign, or separate to one another. In 1 Corinthians 11, Paul moves to talk about another issue in the church. This time, the issue is not the members' immorality, but an issue between the haves and the have-nots. Before this particular passage, we read of issues around idol food, idolatry, and the Lord's Supper in 1 Corinthians 8 to 11 verse 1. Paul then moves to talk about head coverings in worship, which could indicate a theme for this section from chapter 11 through to about chapter 14. That theme being about the correct practice of worship for the Corinthians, that is, the tikanga custom of the karakia, prayer or worship. Both the issues in chapter 8 to 11:1 and in the first half of chapter 11 tend to be viewed as their own issues that do not leak into the passage we're about to examine, 1 Corinthians 11 verses 17 to 22 and 33 to 34. As we read this next passage, again, you might want to follow along with it in front of you, or just listen. But listen for what might stand out about this passage and our kaupapa theme of hospitality. So reading from 1 Corinthians 11. Now in the following instructions, I do not commend you, because when you come together, it is not for the better, but the worse. For to begin with, when you come together as a church, I hear that there are divisions among you. And to some extent, I believe it. Indeed, there have to be factions among you, for only so will it become clear among you who are genuine. When you come together, it is not really to eat the Lord's Supper, for when the time comes to eat, each of you goes ahead with your own supper, and one goes hungry and another becomes drunk. What? Do you not have homes to eat and drink in? Or do you show contempt for the church of God and humiliate those who have nothing? What should I say to you? Should I commend you? In this matter I do not commend you. So then, my brothers and sisters, when you come together to eat, wait for one another. If you are hungry, eat at home, so that when you come together, it will not be for your condemnation. About the other things, I will give instructions when I come. Paul rebukes the Corinthians' practice of the Lord's Supper as doing more harm than good. He begins by locating the Lord's Supper itself as a practice which occurs when they come together. For Paul, at least, this word, synakomai, refers to the practice of the whole church coming together for worship, rather than the individual house communities in Corinth. However, the addressee of this portion of the letter is not the whole church, but some kind of group in the church who are mixing eating practices which do not fit with the ethos or ideology of the Lord's Supper. That is to say, they are acting like the Lord's Supper is a Greco-Roman meal. This is doing so much harm to the community that Paul comes to the conclusion in verse 20 that whatever it is that the Corinthians are doing is not really the Lord's Supper, and whatever intentions the Corinthians are coming to the meal with have little, if anything, to do with participating in the Lord's Supper. Paul continues on now by describing what is actually happening, something which he has probably heard through a report or letter to him. Paul uses the word prolambano in verse 21, which, like in the New Revised Standard Version, we tend to read as to take beforehand or to eat before. However, there is little precedence for understanding this as a temporal thing, as to take before in the contemporary literature. The temporal or time aspect of the pro prefix was actually obsolete by Paul's time. Therefore, either the irregular translation of to take or an emphatic translation of to devour is probably more appropriate. The result of some of the Corinthians taking or devouring is that one goes without or with less, and the other has more or all of it. The problem in the Corinthian Christ group is the avarice or greed of some at the expense of everybody else. This is criticized by Paul to be a humiliation of those who go hungry and an insult to God's church. Furthermore, Paul reveals that actually the greedy have their own homes where they can be greedy together. Some people would interpret this as meaning the offending Corinthians ought to do this type of meal practice in their own homes, among their peers, rather than in the presence of the whole church at the Lord's Supper with some of the poor there as well. I would probably interpret Paul, however, as meaning that these greedy people have such an abundance of resources that they do not need to be greedy when the church comes together. Paul is not advising them to just be Greco-Romans at home and Christians at the Lord's Supper, but he is shaming them because even if the greedy were to go without food at the Lord's Supper, they appear to have the means to provide lavishly for themselves once they return to their homes. What we notice here in the Corinthian community is the internal division between the two or more groups involved in this dispute around the Lord's Supper. This internal division is a refusal of hospitality to those who are outside these particular identity parameters. And it is those who are in control socially who determine the criteria for these identity parameters. While we will not cover it in this lecture, Paul links this denial of hospitality to vast sickness, weakness, and death in the Corinthian parish. As with the denial of hospitality in 1 Corinthians chapter 5, this denial of hospitality in 1 Corinthians 11 has very tangible effects. What is clear from Paul in verses 17 to 22 is that he condemns any practice which divides people because of race, class, or means. And one might add, gender, sexuality, and political views, among many other such similar additions. We shall quickly skim over the parts we're not addressing today. So Paul returns to the Lord's Supper institution narrative to remind the Corinthians of the practice from which their meal comes from. And in response to verses 17 to 22, when he connects it with the narrative about the institution of the Lord's Supper, Paul writes the remainder of chapter 11. He instructs the Corinthians of their need to examine themselves before eating the bread and drinking the cup. And he says if they do this, then they will escape their present condemnation, which is manifesting in the community in illness, weakness, and death. This self-examination is a part of the solution which Paul gives for this internal division or internal exclusion occurring in the Corinthian practice. Onwards to verses 33 and 34, however, as a part of Paul's solution for the Corinthians, he provides some specific instructions for them. He says that when the Corinthians come together as a whole for worship, for the Lord's Supper, they must Allelus ektegeste. Again, the New Revised Standard Version and many others translate this as wait for one another. And while we are quite certain of the translation of Allelus as one another, we are far less certain about the specific meaning of ekdeesthe in this context. It is ambiguous at best. I think that ekdeesthe is better translated as receive, meaning to act hospitably in this context. Paul is drawing on the practice of hospitality among one another as the key solution for these internal divisions. That is, Paul specifically exhorts the greedy Corinthians to practice hospitality at the Lord's Supper towards those without, those to whom they have been humiliating, and in this way they will begin to be reconciled with the Corinthians they have taken advantage of, who are known as the have-nots. It is in this way of hospitality that they will become unified with them. In verse 34, Paul then moves to dismiss some typical cultural arguments he anticipates the Corinthians will use against him. That is, Paul anticipates the Corinthians will say something to the effect of, "We, the so-called greedy Corinthians, are eating so much because our appetites are so much larger than our companions, those you say we are humiliating." But Paul closes this possibility by telling them that if this is the case, eat at home so that their appetite will not lead them to take more than their fair share of the meal. However, despite all that, Paul has instructed the Corinthians to do this. Despite all that Paul has instructed the Corinthians to do, this seems to be a temporary fix, as Paul hopes to come to them personally and give them a fuller set of instructions. Therefore, it would appear that Paul believes hospitality is the beginning of reconciliation, but not necessarily the wholeness of reconciliation for the Corinthians. Paul identifies an internal division occurring at the Lord's Supper in Corinth, as opposed to the issue occurring in 1 Corinthians 5. This type of exclusion, an exclusion of class, social ranking, or wealth, is unacceptable in the eyes of Paul. At the Lord's Supper, similar to the way that Paul talks about salvation in the Galatians, where he says, "There is no longer Jew or Greek, there is no longer slave or free, there is no longer male and female, for all of you are one in Christ Jesus." And perhaps we could add to that, neither is there rich nor poor, high status or low status, honourable or dishonourable, etc., etc., in this circumstance. Where these transient things exist in our lives, we should not allow them to keep us apart at the church, especially above all in participating in the Eucharist. As a means of overcoming our tendency to be focused on the non-important in others' lives, Paul exhorts the Corinthians to focus on offering hospitality to those who we might consider as other to ourselves. From our overview on Manaakitanga, we can clearly see the direct relationship between the actions of the greedy Corinthians and the weakness, sickness, and death among the whole community. The practice of the greedy Corinthians is a failure to recognize the tapu, or intrinsic being, of the other people at the meal. This failure diminishes both the greedy and the victims of greed. And this diminishment leads to the inability and lessened capacity to relate rightly to themselves and all other beings, which, when dire, manifests through division, sickness, and death. In Pākehā terms, perhaps, when I become greedy, I hurt myself and others, and we're both dehumanized. This dehumanization causes psychological, physiological, and spiritual dissonance in myself and my victims. And this dissonance, when the internal stress becomes unmanageable, results in the ill health of communities and people, and brings death. And while all of this analysis is not necessarily directly about hospitality, these are all issues and concepts which inform, or should inform, our decisions around offering or withdrawing hospitality to others. Therefore, I think we get two perspectives from Paul regarding the inclusion and exclusion of people at the hospitality offered at the table. First, Paul calls us to associate or mix with all people, Christian, non-Christian, regardless of their behaviour or morality. But for those who specifically identify as Christian with the church, likely those who have been baptised, Paul instructs the Corinthians to exclude those who call themselves Christ followers but are characterised by unrepentant immoral behaviours. To people such as these, the Corinthians must hold back their relationships with them and even refuse hospitality to them. However, exclusion is not warranted at the Lord's Supper on the grounds of social issues or society's ways of valuing people. Instead, all people are caught equally and called to come equally to the Lord's table. Now we turn to the implications and applications of what Paul has written for us today. I think from what we do have of Paul's correspondence, we are left to grapple with Paul's instructions. This correspondence with the Corinthian church exhorts us to consider all of the various aspects of our own context and make decisions in light of our own context on the extension or recession of hospitality. We must judge whether Paul's advice to the Corinthian church is wise and useful as concrete guidelines or as guiding principles, or as something else entirely. And we must ask ourselves if Paul's instructions need contextualizing for us today in the West. The place of food and eating in Western cultures does not occupy the same space as it did in the ancient cultures. Offering the food of one's table, inclusion into the table through hospitality, used to be a sign of the depth of the social relationship between the host and guests. Only those who held the deepest friendships would be invited to the table. Therefore, this means that those excluded from the table exist outside of these intimate relationships. Hence, are there any other types of practices in our cultures, which could serve as a better social conscience for immorality in the church? Does Paul go too far, perhaps, by ordering the Corinthians to withdraw all association with the immoral Christians? Does Paul not go far enough in talking about reconciliation with these people? Do we act too inclusive towards immoral Christians in the church? Or should we be forced to come together with people who are different from us at the Lord's Supper even? Perhaps we should abandon the practice of what Paul says for the original tikanga or customs of this land. Well, how does Paul's wisdom hold together with the wisdom in Ao Maori, the Maori world? That is the wisdom of the land from which most of us were birthed. In this section of the lecture, the implications, this is your part to think over and discuss. I am going to leave it to you. There are many different ways that we can apply what we have talked about today, and there are many other ways you can apply 1 Corinthians 5, 9 to 13, and 11, 17 to 22, and 33 to 34. Especially if you disagree with me on different points of what Paul appears to be saying to the Corinthians. While we might be tempted to very quickly expel the unsavoury people from our communities and slam culturally homogenous communities with their failure to be in unity with the breadth and depth of the church, we ought to take one final step and judge Paul through the lens of Christ. And judge Paul for much of what Paul has to say in all of his letters is deeply embedded in culture and might not necessarily translate well into how we practice life and hospitality today. Is the inclusion and exclusion of hospitality in need of translation for us? Thank you.